Hey everyone, my name's Sam Murphy. I'm a master's student at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. Today I'll be taking you through my master's project where I've been applying transition engineering tools and methods to look at greenhouse gas mitigation for the dairy agriculture industry in Canterbury. So agriculture accounts for roughly half of New Zealand's total emissions, and dairy cows alone contribute just under a quarter of New Zealand's emissions, more than the entire transport sector. On the right, we've got the wicked problem definition, which I've adapted from the transition engineering textbook. So we'll just work our way around that. The system works great. It produces a lot of milk solids and provides approximately 50,000 jobs. The system is unsustainable due to the high use of land, water, finite resources, as well as there are social issues. New Zealand has currently got a mental health crisis in rural communities. The system satisfies a need. I put in brackets kind of. We'll come back to this on a later slide. The system obviously causes a lot of harm. Historically, there's the draining of wetlands and deforestation, and currently there's greenhouse gas emissions and other ecological damage that occurs. The system must be changed. This one's obvious. And then finally, and importantly, the system can't change. This is probably the most important bit here. This is what makes this an interesting problem to tackle. So some of the reasons are there's like a lot of cultural inertia. People are unwilling to change because they want to keep doing things the way that they've always been done. Dairy farms are in a lot of debt, so they often struggle to come up with the funds required to transition to a lower impact mode of agriculture. There's a lack of imagination, and there's a lack of infrastructure to support growing other crops. And then finally, there's the profit motive. Dairy agriculture is highly profitable in New Zealand. So for my project, we decided to zoom in on the Canterbury region. Canterbury is interesting for a number of reasons. Over the past few decades, we've seen a massive growth in dairying in Canterbury, both in the number of cows on the land, but also in intensification in chemical use and other farming practices. Other local impacts of dairying include coal use in milk processing facilities, ecosystem damage due to fertiliser use and nutrient leaching on dairy farms, and many people are living with high nitrate levels in their drinking water, which is above the level at which can cause cancers. Finally, on the right, we have a satellite image of Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. Te Waihora is a culturally significant site to Kaitahu, the indigenous Māori tribe of the South Island, and it was also a historical food gathering site for the tribe. As you can see, the lake has now turned the colour green, and this is largely due to nitrogen and phosphorus running into the lake from the surrounding catchment. So many studies that aim to reduce emissions from dairy agriculture tend to focus on tweaking management strategies or technological solutions, such as feeding cows seaweed, that largely enable business as usual milk solids production to continue, but don't achieve the deep emissions reduction requirement that we need. What I think is really powerful about the transition engineering way of thinking is that it encourages us to reconsider what the essential need is that is met by a given activity system. In this case, we've decided to define the essential need as producing nutrition for humans. We argue that producing milk solids in itself is not an essential activity, especially given that, as I mentioned on a previous slide, 95% of milk solids produced in New Zealand are exported in the form of a low-quality commodity milk powder. Our hypothesis is that by starting with defining the essential need as providing human nutrition and looking at emissions reduction strategies from a whole systems perspective can yield deeper emissions reduction than strategies which focus on single sources of emissions. We use the transition engineering tool, the InTIME method, as a guide to developing our 4 research objectives. For the rest of my tutorial, I'll be focusing on objective 2, which is the examining of future scenarios, and I'll be talking a little bit about the whole farm system model, which I've been using to explore those scenarios. So this block diagram gives a bit of an overview of the farm system model which we developed. It allows us to play around with on-farm decisions such as management practice, fertiliser use, water use, and production, and then look at what the impacts of that are across the whole system. So starting with things like inputs to the farm such as fertilisers and imported feed, transporting those things to the farm, what happens on the farm obviously, and then transporting and processing the products that are produced on the farm. So the green box on this slide represents the farm system model, which I showed you on the previous slide. On the left, we've got the inputs to that model, which include options for managing the farm, options for how the land is used on the farm, and financial parameters. We use two software tools to support the modelling, OverCSI, which I'll introduce on the next slide, and renewable energy modelling software, System Advisor Model. As outputs, we get the production level of production on the farm, total operating costs, revenue, and then the net emissions and carbon dioxide equivalent, as well as the nutrients that are lost to the environment. So OverCSI is the science version of Overseer FM, which is a decision support software for helping farmers to make management decisions and do their nutrient budgeting. It accepts inputs for management practices, things like fertiliser use, stocking numbers on a monthly basis, and it is usually used to either provide predictive scenarios, so looking into up to 10 years in the future, or to do nutrient budgeting for the past financial year. One thing I intend to do, which has not been done yet in OverCSI, is to model future climate scenarios, so looking ahead to the years 2050 and 2100, how these farm systems perform under those, I guess, projected climate scenarios and the associated weather that comes with those. Overseer requires that we choose a specific location for our farm modelling, so we decided to go with Lincoln University Dairy Farm, which is situated just south of Christchurch. It's 164 hectares of irrigated farmland, and it's run as a commercial dairy farm using what is considered best practice for intensive dairy agriculture. We thought it was a good option for our modelling, given that the climate and the soils are representative of most Canterbury dairy farms. So here we've got some of the scenarios which we've modelled so far. Business as usual represents typical Canterbury farming practices. And then we've got two scenarios which are currently being proposed by the industry. The green urea scenario is where fossil fuel-based nitrogen fertiliser is replaced with urea that is made from green hydrogen produced in New Zealand. And the bovine feed additive is where cows are fed 1.5 grams per day of a feed additive, which reduces their methane production. Then we have two scenarios in which the essential need of human nutrition is met by other food sources that aren't milk solids, and we're just using wheat as an example crop for this for these scenarios. So we've got a scenario where 100% of the land is being used to grow milling wheat, and then we've got the wheat scenario coupled with the green urea scenario. So a quick look at some of our preliminary results shows us that switching the production of human nutrition away from producing milk solids achieves a far greater emissions reduction than the technological solutions alone, albeit with a drop in profitability. However, the penalty in profitability does reduce if farmers have to pay for all of their carbon emissions. Currently, farmers in New Zealand only have to pay for 5% of their emissions. One of the common arguments for transitioning away from producing milk is that milk solids are supposedly an important source of protein. However, we can see here that even just growing wheat, the cost for producing a kilogram of protein is greatly reduced compared to growing milk solids. So what I think is needed is a switch in thinking away from the single-minded productivity and profit-focused approach, which is about maximizing milk solids production, towards the transition engineering approach, which brings us back to what is the essential need that is met by the system allows us to achieve a far greater potential for emissions reduction. The next steps for my project are to look at more diverse types of cropping systems and combinations of the previous strategies which I've looked at to try to achieve even greater emissions reduction potential. And then I'll get into looking at some of the barriers to achieving that change here in Canterbury. I hope this has been enjoyable and informative for you. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or if you want to suggest any scenarios that you think I should look at. Thanks very much.